Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill Obrien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Monday edition of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 25th day of November in the year 2019. It is the last week of November. It is Thanksgiving week. And, you know, I don't need to remind, I'm sure, everyone that Thursday is Turkey Day, so-called. And I've said it before in previous years at this on this week, and I'll say it again. It may be my favorite of all the holidays. Because very honestly, I mean, you can look historically in terms of the issue of Native Americans and such. But unlike other holidays, this is the one that seems to me you really have to scrounge to find negatives associated with this holiday. Because it basically focuses on everyone just ultimately reflecting on the benefits and the good things in their lives. And I think it's based on the assumption, and I agree fully, that when you reflect on your life, all of us realize that we do have good things in our lives. Sometimes bad things come up, and they seem to dominate our lives, and they make it a little bit difficult to appreciate the positives. This holiday basically celebrates the positives and reminds us that it's important to sit down and reflect upon them and appreciate them. More specifically, appreciate the people in our lives responsible for making these good things happen. The people we love, the people we depend on, the people we work with, the people we live in the neighborhood with, whatever. It's really important to appreciate those around us who make our lives what they are in terms of the positive aspects of those lives. And I really think this is a special holiday and a special week. So let me take this opportunity to wish everyone a wonderful, wonderful Thanksgiving. And I hope that everything that you give thanks for is something that you can continue to appreciate until next Thanksgiving, because I think that's very important. Let me also tell you that we're going to have to forego a live program on tomorrow's program. We've got schedule conflicts and it's impossible. But it looks like we will be back and ready to go on Wednesday. So we will do that, and that'll be the day before Thanksgiving. But again, since we're not going to be together tomorrow, I do want to take this opportunity and hope everybody has a wonderful week and a wonderful day on Thursday. I know many folks are going to be buying groceries and preparing for the big day when families get together. I was talking to a lady this morning. She's an acquaintance is all. In fact, I don't even know her name, to be honest with you. But I see her occasionally, and we were just chatting. And she was telling me her son was here from Florida. And in spite of the wonder, we were talking about what beautiful weather we've been having the last few days. And she said her son is up from Florida and he's freezing. I can appreciate that. I can appreciate that. But the fact that her son was up here for Thanksgiving with his mom from Florida kind of clicked in to me that that's really what this week and this holiday is all about. So again, I hope everybody has a wonderful, wonderful Thanksgiving. It's been a while since we've been together. I do appreciate that. There are a couple of things that have been going on in my life, which I'm not going to dwell on, but I will share with them. One of them is medical. Took a little bit of a spill almost 2 weeks ago. And did some serious damage to my left leg. And I've been in and out of doctors' offices ever since. They've been doing ultrasounds, fearing blood clots. I banged my leg and have a pretty significant contusion on it, what the doctors call an edema. And I had to go this morning for a checkup, but I had to basically share with them that the last few days it's been much, much better. The pain has dissipated substantially. It's still uncomfortable, but it's not anything that I can't bear. The first few days was extremely difficult. I have to say, I couldn't sleep. Just the sheet, the bed sheet, touching it would wake me up. I mean, that's how sensitive it was, and you know, so it's been kind of a slow process. It'll be almost 2 weeks tomorrow. I think it's 2 weeks tomorrow to be exact. And that's one thing. The other thing is I made a major change in transmission. I shifted from DSO with the phone company to the cable package. And I was a little bit uncertain about the connections for the program. But it appears, and Bob and I spent several minutes together this morning chatting, it appears that everything is fine. We have a good connection, and everything is fine. So I did want to share that with you. So, and I guess, you know, that may be a good thing. It may be a bad thing. It may be a draw. I don't know. But anyway, it's a change, and I wanted to share it with you. We would love to hear from you if you'd like to give us a call and share with us your reactions to some of the issues dominating the news. And, of course, the major issue dominating the news, of course, has been the impeachment hearings that we've been exposed to over the previous 2 weeks. And now, of course, we're looking forward to the reports. The Intelligence Committee is writing up its report, which it'll give to the Judicial Committee. The Judicial Committee will then make the decision on drawing up articles of impeachment, and then there will be a trial before the United States Senate, and that operation will be chaired by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts. And it appears, and most people I think are concluding, that articles of impeachment is a given. They are also concluding that exoneration by the Republican-controlled Senate is also a given. And so I think we need to take those two things and consider them seriously. And I want to do that. So, you know, if you have thoughts, ideas, concerns, fears, hopes, whatever they might be, please know that our listening audience would love to hear from you. Not only me, but those others listening in as well. We have a phone number, an 800 number, that'll get you directly into the Head On Radio Network studios. Bob is there, and he'll immediately connect you, and you'll be on the air with us live. The phone number is 844-THE-HORN. That's 844-843-4676. Much easier to remember, 844-THE-HORN. If you'd like to send me an email, please know that I would love to hear from you, and I'll do the very best I can to respond to me if you do indeed send me an email. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. Since it's been well over a week, almost 2 weeks since we've been together, let me repeat that number because it's been a while. It's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906, lowercase, all one word, no punctuation. waobrien 906 @gmail.com. If you'd like to communicate with me directly via our Facebook page, you can do that as well. I will admit that it's been a few days, several days, since I put anything on our Facebook page. I really don't have an excuse other than the issues that I raised with you a few moments ago. But I hope to do better. And if you go to our Facebook page, just go to Facebook's homepage, facebook.com, and you'll see a search box at the top. And if you type into that search box the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution, you will be onto our Facebook page and you'll see a number of postings there. The first posting you come to will be the most recent one, and I will alert you that the most recent one is still pretty much dated a week, 10 days ago, perhaps. Because I've been keeping up with the news and keeping up with the internet. I haven't been in a situation or a frame of mind where I really felt like sitting down and composing much of anything. So, and that's part of the reason, one of the reasons why we haven't been doing our live programs for a while. But I would love to hear from you. And if you go to any of the postings on our Facebook page, at the end of each posting, you will see a share link and a comment link. If you click on the share link, it distributes that particular posting to all the friends on your Facebook account. If you click on the comment link, it gives you the opportunity to send a direct comment back to me. And I will get it, and if I can figure out how to communicate with you, I will do that. If I can't, then I'll raise it on the air, and I'll communicate with you that way. But I do want to acknowledge receipt of your message and let you know that I welcome it, and I take it very, very seriously, and I will do the very best I can to respond to your concerns and your issues accordingly. That's what the program's about since we came on in March of 2013. We're basically beyond the 6.5-year point that we've been doing this program. And we're within 4 months of our seventh anniversary, or the beginning of our 7th year on the air. So again, thank you so very, very much for your continued support, not only of this program, but of Bob Kincaid and Alex and and Agnes and the folks at Head On. I really do appreciate you, and I know that Bob and Agnes do as well. I did want to begin our program by making just a couple of general comments about nothing earth-shattering, nothing new, but I feel like it's been so long since we've been together. We've had 2 weeks of live hearings before the House Committee on live television, and we haven't really had the opportunity to comment about it, think about it, share ideas about it, whatever. So I did want to touch base with you and kind of bring us up to speed on that. I particularly thought, to be honest, first of all, like everyone else that the media has, most people in the media have said the same thing. I don't have anything different. I think any of you that watched any of the live testimony before the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff's committee, must appreciate the quality of the people that we have in the field internationally. Some of the people testifying before the committee, to be very honest with you, were beyond impressive. Former Ambassador Yovanovitch, who was displaced in Kiev, is a perfect example of that. Mr. Taylor, the person appointed to replace her, extremely impressive. I do believe that the testimony this past week of Sondland was particularly dramatic and particularly important. Please believe me, I don't put Sondland in the same category of professionalism as I do the former ambassador or Bill Taylor who replaced her, or some of the others that testified live before Adam Schiff's committee. I thought they were extremely impressive, extremely dedicated, lifelong public servants. It was kind of reinforced and renewed our strength and confidence in the fact that we have incredibly impressive people out there in the field. And I think these folks were evidence of that. Over the days and nights that these testimonies, the testimony of each of these people and the information they provided on the whole Ukraine incident, I heard not one commentary of negative, although I did hear about a few negatives coming from Fox on a particular issue. But generally speaking, I think most of the response to these people has been extremely impressive. I know mine was. I sat there listening to Bill Taylor's the day of testimony, which was Wednesday a week ago. And I was so impressed with his professionalism and his dedication and his reluctance to be drawn into political squabbles and political issues and to remain outside the politics that seem to be dividing our nation in ways that are more extreme than it's ever been divided before. I was impressed by that. I was impressed by the previous ambassador, Yovanovitch. Same thing. So I think, and if you would like to react to those folks, then by all means, we'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear from you on that particular situation. As far as the behavior of the president is concerned, I've been really moved, I've noticed that despite the president's rather blasé attitude towards these impeachment hearings as they were going on, the fact of the matter is it's become very clear that they are having an impact on the president. A personal impact. There was a story in this morning's Washington Post, and I wanted to just touch base with you on it. But it's about the fact that in recent days, especially with the impeachment hearings going on, the president has spent more and more time in the residence at the White House and less time in the Oval Office. His supporters continue to say he's working around the clock from the break of dawn in the morning until midnight at night. We've heard all of that before. But the fact of the matter is, whatever work he is doing, he's doing it from the residence, not from the Oval Office. And the people who are putting these stories together for the Washington Post, New York Times, and other media outlets are basically attributing this additional time in the residence to the president's impact, to the impact of the impeachment hearings on the president. Of course, in the residence is where he listens to them live. The residence is where he becomes a fan of Fox and Friends in the morning, almost every morning. The end of last week, I was watching another network. It could have been CNN. It could have been MSNBC. I'm not sure which. The only one I know that I wasn't watching was Fox. But in the course of the conversation about what the particular issue was, one of the commentators made the point that the president was live on another network at that moment. It was in the morning during the 9 to 10 hour. And I immediately knew that network was Fox. So I turned it on and I caught about 20 minutes of the president's almost hour-long rant on Fox News that morning. There's been quite a few stories, follow-up stories to that particular hour, because the one thing I noticed it in the 20 minutes I watched and listened, was the fact that the president jumped from issue to issue to issue. He left no stone unturned. He talked about everything. But it was very obvious that the impeachment issue itself is having an impact on him and on his behavior. There's absolutely no question that it's driving him more and more to go on the road, to conduct rallies, and to appear before live crowds, live audiences at rallies, almost as if he's countering the negatives of the impeachment hearings with the positive of the live audience and his ability to excite such an audience. I think we've commented before. If we didn't, we sure as heck should have. Because whatever negatives you might have to say about this president, his ability to stimulate an audience is extremely impressive. And one would be making a mistake not to at least acknowledge that. The president's performance and ability to keep an audience entertained and keep an audience tuned in is extremely impressive. I spent almost 50 years on my feet before classes. Some of the very large classes, well over 100 people. And so I've had quite a bit of experience speaking before groups. And holding the attention of the groups is not easy. It, for most of us, doesn't come naturally. It's something that you really have to work at. I don't think the president works at it because, very honestly, I'm not convinced he works at much of anything. So again, I guess it's a gift. But the fact of the matter is, I've watched him before a live audience. And his ability to touch the audience and to communicate with the audience is almost magic. It's a gift that many of us wish we had, few of us do. And I think it's important to recognize that, because this is the place where the president feels most comfortable. And of course, part of the reason is because he finds it more necessary than ever to continually touch base with his base and to continually work on solidifying that base, because more and more it's becoming clear that he's going to need to be able to rely on that base. It's also extremely important to recognize that when we talk about his base, we tend to consider it in the context of the elections, of his ability to compete with Democrats. But the fact of the matter is that base is the key ingredient of his influence with Republicans. One of the things I've noticed, and I think it's important to mention this, is that since the hearings ended last weekend, not weekend, but the last week, I believe on Thursday was the last live hearing. So we've had since last Friday to assess the impact of the hearings. And I've been watching as different networks address this issue in different ways. But at the same time, there's a common denominator to all of them. And that is that as they go into the field and they measure voter response to the impeachment hearings and try to measure whether, in fact, there's any measurable reaction to these live impeachment hearings, whether, in fact, support seems to be moving away from the president toward the Democrats or not moving at all is significant. And most of the networks seem to be focusing on that issue. Many of them, I saw NBC, I've seen CBS, I've seen CNN, with journalists, reporters in the field who are in small town America in order to try to gauge the impact of the hearings on people's support of or opposition to the president and his position on Ukraine, his position on impeachment. And one of the things that has been patently consistent so far, but on the other hand, it's important to mention we're only talking 3 or 4 days beyond the end of live hearings. It seems to me before we have any opportunity to detect measurable results, if there are any, in terms of political movement in the electorate at large, it's going to take much more than that. It's going to take another week, 10 days before the polls are able to detect any movement, if there is any. I think that's particularly important. But the one thing to note so far is that there doesn't seem to have been any immediate response in terms of movement one way or the other. Most of the in-field commentators seem to be concluding their reports with the same message. And that is the people who went into the hearings opposed to the president came out of the hearings even more opposed. In other words, they found in the hearings the kind of evidence they expected to find, they looked to find, and indeed they did find it. On the other hand, the same thing applies to the president's supporters. Those people who were supporting the president prior to the live impeachment hearings came out of the hearings even more solid, it seems, in their support for the president. Many of them, I've picked up a sense that they feel that the president more and more is becoming the victim of this, that the media is piling up on him, the State Department is piling up on him, lifelong employees of the FBI and the Justice Department are piling up on him, and they really feel even more supportive of the president with the live hearings than they did before. I think all of this is very significant because there's no question that the Democratic leadership's major intent of holding the hearings and of trying to frame impeachment in a way which makes it understandable to and appealing to the voters, to the people, it doesn't appear that that's having any material impact politically, at least not yet. It appears that substantial numbers of people aren't moving one way or the other. On the other hand, it appears that people are becoming more firm in the positions they had going into the hearings. Those people that have been opposed to the president are finding all sorts of evidence in the testimony to reinforce their position and to strengthen the degree to which they believe this president should be impeached. There's absolutely no question that that's happened with the leadership of the Democratic Party. I don't think we need to go back very far to recall that Speaker Pelosi was really not in favor of impeachment at all at the beginning. And it's only reluctantly and gradually that she's become susceptible first to an inquiry, and then, having witnessed much of the testimony on television, has now become an outspoken advocate of impeachment. I think she's found in the hearings what she needed to find. It's moved her, and it's convinced her. And I think that's true for a lot of people, myself included. I do think part of it, and I go back to the very beginning here, I do think a good portion of that is due to the caliber of the people who have testified. Their professionalism, their character, their commitment to the nation, their awareness of their obligation to not slide into political issues, the necessity that in order to maintain their professionalism, they have to remain aloof from the politics. They've got to keep politics at a distance so that they can function. And all I need do is mention that at the beginning of every witness, when they are introducing themselves, invariably they'll say that they've been a public employee or a public service officer for a number of years and have served under X numbers of Republican and X numbers of Democratic presidents. In other words, their professionalism does not pay any credence at all to the politics of the nation at a particular point in time. If they were appointed by Republican presidents, they've been reappointed by Republicans, and vice versa. These are professionals. And I think it kind of reinforces your faith in the nation and the people working for it to know that there are people of this caliber out there. At the same time, I think it's important to mention, at least, the fact that there's a dramatic difference between these people who've been serving in the trenches, so to speak, and those political appointees who supervise them. I guess what I'm saying, for example, in the State Department, since this is where these people come from, the professionalism of these people who have been serving as ambassadors and assistant ambassadors in the field is so impressive when weighed against the character and behavior of the Secretary of State, Pompeo himself. One has to question his professionalism. One has to question the professionalism of William Barr, the Attorney General, and Mulvaney, Special Assistant to the President. It seems to me that if there's a gap in professionalism and character, it's most visible between the people who are doing the work and the people who supervise them. I haven't seen anywhere near the quality of character and professionalism in any of these secretaries, whether it be Perry, whether it be Pompeo, whether it be Bolton, Barr, Mulvaney, doesn't matter. I haven't seen anything to match the caliber of many of the people who report to them. I think that's impressive and significant. Again, to repeat, I do believe that it's also very significant that the president is spending more and more of his time in the residence, less and less of his time in the Oval Office. Reports are that when he does go out of the White House, he's going out for rallies, he's going out for public events. Occasionally, he sneaks out for a meal, most often at his own hotel in Washington. But beyond that, he's spending more and more time by himself. And I think every couple of days when we experience one of these tweet storms, it seems to me more and more to reflect the amount of alone time that seems to characterize the behavior of this president. The more it almost seems, and I haven't measured this or in any way, it's just a sense I have, that the more time he spends alone, the more bizarre the behavior becomes as reflected in his tweets. Many people believe that his behavior is becoming more and more bizarre anyway, irrespective of tweets. And that may be true. But it does seem to me that the impact of the live impeachment hearings is becoming more and more visible on this particular president. I get the feeling from everything we hear and everything we read that Democrats are on a fast track to move the impeachment issue along. I really do believe that this is significant. I think it's become very evident because there's so much in this president's behavior, not only going all the way back to the campaign of 2016 itself, but to the 3 years that this president has been in office. There's an awful lot that one could point to which suggests impeachable behavior. Obviously, it would require more and more research, more and more documentation. There are 10 items related to the issue of obstruction that are in Volume 2 of the Mueller report. And up until recently, there was quite a bit of debate as to whether impeachment should be approached from the broadest sense rather than from a narrow sense. Maybe in order to make sure that you do everything you can to solicit a yes vote rather than a no vote from the Senate in impeachment, your chances would be improved if you go to the Mueller report and focus on collecting the evidence associated with any number of the 10 obstruction issues listed there. And then there's the issue of the emoluments clause and the clear evidences that exist of open violations of the emoluments clause by this president. But in spite of all of that, and in spite of the conclusion that many have reached and the assumption on which these conclusions are based, that the allegations of impeachment and guilt specifically would be strengthened by going into some of these other areas and coming at impeachment from a number of different perspectives on a number of different issues. It seems that the Democratic leadership has decided to go pretty much in the opposite direction. That rather than broaden the spectrum for considerations of impeachment, the Democratic leadership seems to be more inclined to shrink that perspective and to focus impeachment principally around the issue of Ukraine. The thinking has been, it seems, and I think we mentioned this on a previous program not too long ago. It seems to me the thinking is based on the idea that if you focus on the one issue of Ukraine, it becomes much more manageable, much easier for the American people to understand and grasp, much easier to make the point of impeachable offenses, and much easier to document evidences of those violations of the public trust. I think all of this is significant. I do believe that the Democratic leadership has decided to narrow rather than to broaden the field for allegations of impeachment. On the other hand, it's important to recognize that even if you limit the impeachment inquiry to issues surrounding Ukraine, it's becoming more and more clear that there are more potential issues there than we even thought possible 2 weeks ago. There's absolutely no question, for example, that as the administration continues to forbid current and former employees from testifying and honoring House subpoenas, obstruction of Congress, obstruction of Congress's right to investigate and to conduct oversight of the president, oversight of the executive office, is becoming more and more clear and is coming with more and more evidence to sustain it or support it. The administration continues to keep people from honoring subpoenas, from providing documents upon request, from attending hearings even though requested and then subpoenaed to appear. Right now, we are waiting on a rendering from an appeals court on the issue of McGahn's responsibility to testify. Because ultimately, if the House pushes the violations or ignoring of subpoenas and the request for documents, the only solution to that is to go to court. And by going to court, you're lengthening the investigation itself. You're extending the time period that's going to be spent on impeachment. And once you get into 2018, which I remind you is only a few days more than a month away, and we're in 2020, we're in an election year, the further this issue drags into 2020, the more it infringes on the campaign for the November elections. It seems very clear, not just to me, but I've heard a number of people make the same comment, that this is at least in part the White House strategy to delay and slow down the impeachment process as much as possible, and at the same time to confuse that process as much as possible, to make the issue so complex and so confusing that people who don't have the time to spend on trying to figure it all out and line up all the issues and all the people whose names are being brought into these overall investigations That seems to be exactly the strategy that the president and his supporters are pursuing. To make this whole issue so complicated and so hard to understand that more and more people are going to just throw up their hands and say, to hell with this, I can't figure this out, let somebody else do it. I'll wait until the movie comes out. In other words, I'll wait until somebody clarifies it for me and reduces it to the bottom line, to the minimum, to the outline, if you will. And the thinking, it seems to me, from the perspective of President Trump's supporters, is that as these issues become more complicated and more difficult to figure out and harder to follow, more and more people are going to tune out on the whole issue, stop watching the live hearings, stop listening to the evidence, and ultimately thereby blunt the intent of the Democratic leadership. The whole purpose of the Democratic leadership is to get these hearings out there so more and more people will hear the evidence as presented by the people involved rather than by so-called employees of the deep state, presented by those people who many of these folks don't trust anyway. That seems to be the strategy of the White House. Drive it into court, drag it out, take more and more time, let it extend into 2020, as far into 2020 as possible, reduce the time to conduct a meaningful, well-organized campaign against re-election of this president. And thinking is you have better chance of getting this president elected, especially since most of the polls are indicating that few in his base seem to be inclined to move away from him. If anything, the support for the president seems to be becoming stronger, which plays right into the White House's hands. So this is chess. This is political chess, political strategy at its upper levels. And that's what's going on here, I think. It's becoming more and more difficult for me to figure some of this stuff out. I don't consider myself to be anybody special. The only thing I can say on that score for myself is that have been and continue to plan to put in the time necessary to figure it out. This is what I've decided to do with my life since retirement, is to devote it to reading and research and listening and preparing for these programs. And as long as that's what I've decided to do, then I'm going to make every effort in the world to stay on top of the issues and to do the very best I can to figure them out in order to help those people who don't have the time that I have. It's not intelligence, it's not insight, it's not wisdom, it's time. This takes time. It takes time to stay on top of the major news items that are in the media. Many of us, most of us, don't have that kind of time. You have to depend on the people who do to simplify the issues for us. That's one of the things I'm trying to do. That's one of the benefits I see of this particular program. It offers me an opportunity to do exactly that. And that's really what I've pretty much chosen or decided to devote the rest of my professional life to, now that I've formally retired. To me, this is my professional life. And I consider myself blessed to have a very fulfilling private life with a wonderful family and an absolutely wonderful wife. And I cherish all of those folks, and especially my wife. But I also have a private life and an inclination to stay as involved as I can in what's going on in the world around me. And with these programs, I feel an obligation to do the best I can for the people who so faithfully follow this program. It's become my professional mission in life, I guess. And I take it very seriously. There's one more issue, and this is the lead item from yesterday and into this morning's news, about the dismissal of the Secretary of the Navy, Spencer. I'm particularly interested in this story, I guess because, more than anything else, because my wife's son is career military in the Navy. He just retired about a year ago, maybe a little bit longer than that, from 20-year career in the Navy. And since I've known him and become so fond of him over the years, over the 15 years or so that I've known him, I've become especially sensitive to the Navy and to issues of the Navy. So when this issue came up about the Secretary of the Navy resigning late yesterday, Sunday, I became very interested in that. And again, what we have here is a situation of this president unwilling or refusing to let the people he's appointed to perform these duties do them. It almost seems like he's determined to stick his finger in his nose in issues that he probably ought to leave to somebody else. There's no question from the letter of resignation that Secretary Spencer delivered to the Secretary of Defense that presidential interference, more than anything else, is the reason that prompted Spencer to submit his letter of resignation. From what Spencer says in that letter, President Trump did an end run around the Defense Department. Excuse me. The Secretary of the Navy, Spencer, according to Esper, the Secretary of Defense, did an end run around the Defense Department to try to work out a settlement with the White House over the pending dismissal of Petty Officer Gallagher, who is being court-martialed and dismissed from the SEALs, the Navy SEALs, for behavior unbecoming the Navy and unbecoming the SEALs, posing for pictures with corpses of people that he killed, for example, and engaging in what many people have alleged is unnecessary and extreme brutality in the treatment of captured prisoners and such. The Navy made the decision to oust this guy from the SEALs and to take his pin, the pin of the SEALs, the trident pin, away. And President Trump injected himself in that and insisted that Gallagher be reinstated. And it's because Secretary Spencer, instead of going through proper channels, through the Defense Department and through the Secretary of Defense, and doing an end run around the process and trying to work out a compromise with the White House, that more than anything else seems to have moved the Secretary of Defense, Esper, to request Spencer's letter of resignation. And in Spencer's letter, as I mentioned, he comes down very hard on the president for his involvement and his inclination to stick his nose in places that they really don't belong. The assumption being, of course, that this is a Navy issue. It's a disciplinary issue with the Navy. And for the president to interfere really undercuts the leadership of the Secretary of the Navy. And for that reason, Spencer says he resigned. Again, I think more than anything else, this is not a significant issue in and of itself so much as additional testimony to the inclination of this president to become involved in issues that he needn't become involved in. Personally, I think that this would happen less, maybe not happen at all, if this president devoted more time to being president and to spending time in the Oval Office doing the thing that presidents are supposed to do, instead of spending so much alone time in the residence and conjuring up ways that he could inject himself into the issues where he's neither wanted nor needed. That's kind of my position on it. But again, I haven't done the intensive reading and the intensive research to get on top of all of the details of this issue. But at the same time, I do understand Spencer. And very honestly, I understand Secretary Esper as well. Because there is a chain of command. And if anybody's going to honor the chain of command, it's the leadership of the different branches of the military. And so, from Esper's point of view, when that breaks down, and the Secretary of the Navy tries to do an end run around acceptable procedure, that becomes an issue that seems to warrant a response, and Esper indeed did respond. Beyond that, I don't know. I suspect that there may be more to this theory that'll come out. Maybe there isn't. Because I think once we get back into the middle of the week, once we get back into the impeachment issue, it's probably going to once again dominate the issues, dominate the news, dominate the media. And what that means is that even if there is something in the Spencer resignation that might under ordinary conditions come out publicly, the renewal of the impeachment question might suppress it to the point that that it never surfaces. I don't know that. I'm just guessing that that is indeed a possibility. With that, we've got maybe a minute or two before we get to the top of the hour. That's the end of our first hour. I'd like to spend our second hour on the presentation that I delivered last Tuesday evening, which was the third lecture in a 4-lecture series on the Constitution of the United States. This particular one focused on the issue of ratification of the Constitution, looking at each state and the ratification issue as it played out in each of those states. I've mentioned before that in this story, there were certain states that seemed to become very relevant. There's a story, as it were, that goes with the issue of ratification in particular states. More specifically, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Massachusetts, and New York. It's not an accident that those tend to be the larger states, the states with the most people. Those seems to be the states where ratification becomes more and more a dominant political issue. In many of the other states, impeachment is a given. Excuse me, not impeachment. I'm obsessed with impeachment, obviously. Ratification is a given. In other states, North Carolina and Rhode Island to be specific, opposition to ratification is a given. The conventions are overwhelmingly dominated by opponents of the Constitution rather than supporters of the Constitution. That same situation exists in New York. But even though there's an overwhelming anti-federalist majority elected to the ratification in New York, the leadership of that anti-federalist majority chose not to exercise the power of the majority and vote down ratification immediately, which they could have done. Instead, they went through the motions of a convention and they decided to take on Federalists, the supporters of the Constitution, and engage them in debate on the Constitution. As it turns out, they didn't end up giving unconditional ratification to the Constitution in New York. As it turned out, ratification in New York was conditional on the passage of amendments. Not only that, but the idea of calling a second convention to consider those amendments becomes part of the ratification package in New York. More than anything else, the threat, the promise of a second constitutional convention is what drives James Madison to exercise the kind of leadership he does in the House of Representatives in order to get the Bill of Rights added to our Constitution. It's an important story. I think it's one that all of us should know something about. It's one, unfortunately, that few of us do know that much about. I'd like to devote our second hour to the issue of ratification. You're listening to the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause and take a brief break, and then we'll come back and we'll spend the bulk of our second hour on ratification of the Constitution of the United States. We'll be right back. I hope you'll stay with us. Thank you.
return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's your host, Dr. Bill Obrien. Bill?
I don't have my microphone on. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine.
It was up behind my ears or something, and I wasn't even paying attention to it. To tell you the truth, I got to say, I was excited to get the email chat from you and to know that you were there. And that I got excited, and I forgot to put my microphone on.
Well, I'm really
excited. It's great to hear from you.
I've missed
It's great to hear you.
It's
great to hear you.
It's great to hear you, and I can't wait to hear about the lectures because, unfortunately, I missed it, and I wasn't planning on missing it.
Oh.
So I'm really looking forward to it.
It turned out pretty well. The next one is on the 17th of December, which is 2 weeks from 3 weeks from tomorrow.
Excellent.
2 weeks from next Tuesday. So I got time to put it together, but I'll be honest with you, I'm a little bit leery about that. But fortunately, I've been a little bit worried about each one, and I think that really forces me to do a little bit better job preparing.
Bill, and, I've seen you worry before and come out with something that was mind-blowing and stellar.
Well, I appreciate that. I've always felt in all the years I was teaching that I never could afford to become totally oblivious to being nervous. Because I think that if you are a little bit nervous, it really causes you to make sure you're on your game.
Yeah, it keeps you alert.
I believe that. Keeps you alert, keeps you focused. And for me, it keeps me focused constantly on the people on the receiving end rather than focused principally on myself. I'm always basically looking at it from a point of view, how is what I'm going to say or planning to say going to impact the people who are listening? And that's usually the approach that I try to make, and that's the approach that I've taken with these lectures, because the range of people who attend has been anywhere from 55 to 75 people attending each of the first three lectures. And fortunately, the number is going up rather than down, so I appreciate that. I think this last one was probably the biggest turnout we've had.
Oh, nice.
And we're getting some young folks.
Good.
We didn't on the first one. There was nobody in the room that was under 40, it seemed like. And I said, oh, my God, we're in trouble. But the second one was better. And, of course, friends like Keith Lilly encouraged their students to attend, and a number of them did.
Excellent.
But also high school students attended this last one. In fact, they had me come up and sign. They had to apparently document the evidence that they did attend
for AP
to their high school teachers for AP. Yeah,
excellent.
AP history classes. So it was good. It was encouraging to see young people. So in that sense, I think they went very well so far. And I'm just hoping that I don't drop the ball on number 4.
You're not going
I'm
to.
I'm on third base, and I'm rounding third and heading for home. And I don't want to screw it up now by tripping over myself or whatever. So anyway, I'll do the best I can. And thank you very much. It's great to hear from you, Agnes.
Thank you, Bill. I missed you.
Thank you. Miss you too. Welcome to this, our second hour of this Monday edition of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I made the switch from DSL communications with Frontier to the cable company, to Suddenlink. And I made it during the time over the last week and a half that we haven't been on. And I was telling Bob and Agnes both that I was really concerned that the connection, the audio, would be negatively impacted by the switch. And so far I've been encouraged because it doesn't seem to have all. The connection that I have, the audio that I have is absolutely excellent. So I'm guessing that my fears were unfounded, and that's good. At least I didn't make a change that messed up the whole program. I guess that's what I was afraid of more than anything. Also, let me again remind you, as I did at the beginning of our first hour, we will not be doing a live broadcast tomorrow. There are schedule conflicts, and we all can't kind of get on the same page tomorrow, and that's understandable. We know about it 24 hours ahead of time. So at least we can alert you that we won't be doing a live program tomorrow, but that all things going well, we will be doing a live program on Wednesday. And so I hope that that you'll be able to join us for them, at that time. I appreciate the fact that Wednesday, of course, is the day before Turkey Day, the day before Thanksgiving. A lot of people are going to be busy. Probably a lot of people are going to be off work, but at the same time, they're probably going to be out grocery shopping. And I do understand that as well. So we'll just kind of make the best of it. And we'll allow the fact that it is Thanksgiving holiday and it is the holiday season. We'll kind of let that drive us, and we won't worry about all the little things. So, again, we will not be doing a live program tomorrow, but we do expect to be doing a live program on Wednesday. The first hour, for those of you just joining us, we pretty much spent kind of reviewing the impeachment hearings, the behavior of the president, the strategies, seeming strategies of the Democratic leadership and how they are narrowing the focus of impeachment rather than broadening it. And I have to acknowledge this myself. There have been so many things that this president has done during his 3 years in office and during the campaign leading to his election that I began to see as potentially impeachable, that I felt when the impeachment inquiries began that we would be better served by approaching impeachment from a broader rather than a narrow perspective, rather than focusing the whole thing on Ukraine. It seemed to me that it might be a better idea to go back to the Mueller report and the 10 issues in the Mueller report, Volume 2, related to obstruction of justice that might lead to more articles of impeachment, which to me seem to suggest a better chance of a guilty verdict. But like everybody else, I've pretty well become convinced that the chances of a guilty verdict with the Senate we have and the Republican majority controlling that Senate that we have, that a guilty verdict is probably something that it would be exhausting and a waste of time to think about. I've been and remain a consistent supporter of impeachment. I think the House of Representatives has a constitutional responsibility, according to its oath, to impeach when impeachable behavior is evident. And I think that's true. I think it was true when the Mueller report was put together. I also think it's true now in the Ukraine situation. I also understand that the leadership of the Democratic Party is looking at the issue of impeachment, which is their constitutional duty. But they also are politicians, and they can't take their eye off the political ball. And they realize that the major issue in this whole enterprise is the ability of winning citizens over to their point of view. I don't think Democrats' leadership at all is under any illusions about getting a guilty vote from the United States Senate, given its makeup. But I do believe that leaders of the Democratic Party do anticipate the possibility, if not probability, of attracting some Republican dissidents over to their side, which would make whatever happens in impeachment bipartisan rather than partisan. And so the fact that the leadership would decide to narrow the focus of impeachment and concentrate on the Ukraine issue as being easier to understand and easier to people with complicated, full lives who don't have the time to devote to the research, to understand the issues and potentially end up supporting impeachment, I see their point. I do see their point. Anyway, those are the issues that we dealt with in our first hour. And as I mentioned at the end of our first hour, I wanted to spend the second hour kind of sharing with you the third in the 4 lecture series on the Constitution that I've been privileged to deliver here in this region of southern West Virginia, and that delivery was last Tuesday night, a week ago tomorrow. And I haven't had the opportunity to be with you live since then. So I wanted to share the presentation and some of the things that came out in it. So that's really where I want to put the emphasis in this second hour. If you have reactions or responses to our first hour, please know that we would love to hear from you. Again, we'll be back on the air on Wednesday. What we don't do today and related to these lectures I've delivered, we can cover on Wednesday. If you're inclined to call and to comment on some of the issues we talked about in our first hour, that becomes our priority. Not my plans, but the reality that this program is designed principally to benefit you. And if you have an issue that you would like to raise with our other listeners, then I feel honored to be able The number is 800, the horn. If you're into numbers, that translates into 844. Excuse me, it's not 8. I think I said 800. It's 844, the horn. That translates into 844-843-4676. But again, it's much easier to remember 844, the horn. Or if you'd like to send me an email or a Facebook message, I would welcome either. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. And on Facebook, just go to one of the postings on our Facebook page and click on the comment button at the end of each posting, and that'll provide you the opportunity to send a comment directly to me on whatever aspect or issues related to the program that you would like to focus on. Please know that we look forward to hearing from you, and in advance, I thank you for the time and effort that it would take you to do that. So thank you. I'd like to spend the rest of our time on ratification of the Constitution. I don't know, to be honest with you, whether we'll be able to totally finish it in this hour. I have to share with you the fact that this third lecture last Tuesday was longer than either the first one or the second one. The first one was about an hour and 15 minutes. The second one was perhaps a little bit shorter than that, maybe an hour and 5 minutes, 10 minutes at the most. But this third one went almost 90 minutes. It almost went for an hour and a half. There's just so much to cover. And I don't want to skip any of it, to be very honest with you, because I think all of it's relevant. And I think all of it speaks to the relevance of the rest of it, if that makes sense. If I start leaving things out, it's going to detract from the significance of the things that I don't leave out, that I include. So I really think it's important to touch base and cover all the bases, not just some of them. I don't want the clock to dictate the quality of the presentation, if that makes sense. So if we have to extend some of this into our first hour on Wednesday, then that's great with me. I look forward to that. What I probably would do on Wednesday is the same thing we did today, which is hold it for our second hour and devote our first hour, or at least a portion of it, to what might happen in Washington between now and then. And after 3 years of experience with this administration, I'm well aware, as you are, that a lot can happen and probably will happen between now and then. It hasn't failed us yet. So again, what we don't get covered today, we will cover in our next program. Back to the issue of ratification of the Constitution. We will remember that as the Constitutional Convention began to reach an end, come to an end, it adjourned on the 17th of September, 1787. The issue of ratification of the Constitution became part of the conclusion of the Constitution. In other words, once the Constitution was laid out, the procedure for making it the law of the land was added to the end of the Constitution. And it was principally the doing, as much of the entire Constitution was, of James Madison. Madison was insistent that this Constitution must be approved by the people of the United States, not the states themselves. To Madison, that was a major flaw of the Articles of Confederation. The fact that the Articles were never approved or ratified by the people, but rather were ratified and approved by the states. The implication of that is clear. If the states approved the creation of the Articles of Confederation, then by definition that meant that the states remained superior to the government created under the Articles of Confederation. In other words, ratification by the states meant state sovereignty, state power at the expense of national power. Madison knew that philosophically, the Constitution of the United States needed to be ratified by the people of the United States. So consequently, the Constitution specified that ratification would become a fact when the new Constitution was ratified by the people of the United States in 9 state conventions, when 9 of the 13 states ratified the Constitution of the United States, it would become the law of the land. As it turned out, ratification by 9 states was accomplished of Virginia and New York ratified. And it became very clear to the founders, to the Federalists, that you really couldn't have a viable union without Virginia and New York. That even though legally, according to the requirements of the Constitution, 9 states had ratified, 9 states were in the fold, so to speak. You had to have the states of Virginia and New York because they were 2 of the largest states. You couldn't very well have a union made up of 9 states when 2 of the largest states, New York and Virginia, weren't in the union. So consequently, the ratifications of Virginia and New York in June of 1788 and into July of 1788 for New York were critical. And when both of those states ultimately did ratify, even though New York's was, as I mentioned in our first hour, New York's was conditional on a calling of a second convention to ratify amendments. In other words, the condition were the amendments, not the convention. The convention was a mechanism to produce the amendments, but it was the amendments that became the condition for ratification. That's important. It's a minor distinction, seemingly, but it's really not. It's an important one. Because if the second convention had been the condition of ratification, New York would have been not in the Union. Because Madison's whole strategy in Congress was to get Congress to approve amendments so that it would not be necessary to go the other route, which was the second convention route. And one of the things that I mentioned last Tuesday night, and I had to emphasize because it's so important, Madison was absolutely convinced that to call a second convention to amend the Constitution of the United States was effectively a kiss of death for the Constitution. Madison believed and shared it with his closest compatriots that whatever happened, we would have to avoid the calling of a second convention. Because once the Constitution of the United States was back on the table and subject to debate, we would likely lose much of what we already had in the Constitution as drafted at Philadelphia. We didn't have a Bill of Rights. We didn't have protections for human rights. So Madison's conclusion was, let's make sure we have those. The worst thing we want is to bring the states back together again to begin to re-debate the Constitution and where amendments were most appropriate. Because once we got into that, Madison believed everything that had been accomplished would be lost. In other words, according to the Constitution of the United States, Article 5, which deals with the issue of amendment of the Constitution, stipulates that there are two ways of amending the Constitution. One is when amendments or an amendment is approved by 2/3 of both houses of Congress, the House and the Senate. And when 2/3 of both houses approve an amendment or a body of amendments, then the next step in the amendment process is to send them out to the states for ratification. And when 3/4 of the states approve these amendments, they become part of the Constitution of the United States. That's the first way. That's the way Madison determines these amendments must be handled. The second way is when 2/3 of both houses of Congress, the second way is that when 2/3 of the states request a second convention to consider an amendment or to consider a body of amendments. That method of amendment has never been used. Given Madison's determination to avoid it, it's understandable why it's never been used. It was too dangerous to the Constitution itself. Well, then the question is, why in the name of heaven, if it was that dangerous, is it even in there? Why did Madison and the other nationalists who supported the Constitution, Franklin and Washington and Pinckney and the rest of them, why did they even include that second way to amend the Constitution? The answer, it seems to me, is in the politics of the 1780s. There was so much loyalty to the states, so much support for the preservation of state power at the expense of federal power, that you had to include things in the Constitution which appealed to those most protectives of state power. You couldn't allow everything that even smacked of state power to be eliminated from the Constitution. Where possible, you had to put it in there because having those things in the Constitution reassured the supporters of the states. But as Hamilton said at the time, it's never going to be possible to get 2/3 of these states to agree on anything. To assume that 2/3 of the states would be able to agree on an amendment, on the wording of an amendment, or a whole body of amendments, was a dream. Hamilton believed that getting amendments through Congress, both houses, and then out to the states, was the only viable way that amendments would ever be approved. And history has borne him out. That's the only way that the Constitution has ever been amended. Until now. We know, we've done programs on this, not recently, but in past months, about the move for a second convention and the extent to which conservative groups in this country seek a second convention. And already, these people have proposed the kinds of changes they would like to see a second convention make in the Constitution of the United States? I have done a substantial amount of writing against a second convention. My reason for that opposition is probably principally because Madison was so opposed to it. And he was the architect, the author of the Constitution itself. If the guy that created it feels that it's that vulnerable to a convention, then I'm not going to support a convention. I have seen evidences of what some conservatives want to do once a second convention is called. I've seen evidence of a desire to return power to the states in the name of returning it to the people. But in reality, it would not be going to the people of the states. It would be going to the political leadership of that states, which over the last several years has become increasingly conservative and Republican. In other words, to call a second convention to revise the Constitution of the United States would be to allow the Republican Party to oversee those revisions of the Constitution. I'm not willing to accept that. And I think if you think about it, probably you're not willing to accept it either. Because many of the things that we cherish, which are associated with equality, civic equality, political equality, and human rights, would be lost. Yesterday, in the media, on radio, I heard a discussion about a recent poll taken among high school students in the United States. And one of the most interesting conclusions of this poll, of this survey, was that many high school students, especially students of color and women, believe that the First Amendment to the Constitution goes too far. That there needs to be additional limitations on such things as freedom of speech and freedom of the press and freedom of assembly and all the rest of it. Clearly, although I don't think the survey indicated this, but this was my conclusion, clearly part of this is based on the idea of the abuse of women and the abuse of minorities in our society. I believe the thinking of these high school students is that if there were specific limitations on First Amendment freedoms, then people wouldn't be as inclined to speak about or publish about things that are so critical and so negative toward racial minorities and toward women. That, in other words, restricting and limiting the First Amendment would better protect women and minorities in our society. I'm not really sure that that's true at all, but I think that's probably what many of these young people have in mind. With that thinking out there on the part of so many of our young people, with the thinking being amongst so many young people that there needs to be severe limits on the First Amendment, I'm not inclined to believe that this is the time to be calling second conventions. and to put the whole Constitution of the United States back on the table. That's my thinking. And so let me share with you, as far as the story of ratification itself goes, it seems to be important to understand the context, the background of ratification. And of course, what that means is, in order to understand the background for ratification, we need to understand the background that produced the Constitution itself. In other words, what was the political context that led Madison and those who worked with him and supported him to believe that revision of the Articles of Confederation was so necessary? And we know, because we've dealt with this document before, that Madison put these ideas together in a document which he shared with many of those colleagues he communicated with regularly, in a document entitled Vices of the Political System of the United States. The date that this was put together officially was April of 1787, the month before the Constitutional Convention was scheduled to meet. Madison sent copies of his Vices document to many of those people who would be attending the Constitutional Convention the next month. And in his Vices of the Political System of the United States, he laid out his case against state sovereignty. As you read the 12 particular items that Madison believed constituted vices of the political system under the Articles and necessitated revision of the Articles in the upcoming Constitutional Convention, it becomes very clear as you look at all of these 12 that Madison believed the major problem of the Articles was state sovereignty, not citizens' inability to govern, not citizens being uninformed, because that could be fixed, not citizens' education, not citizens' inability to participate intelligently in their government. To Madison, the major villain that required amending the Articles of Confederation or revising the Articles of Confederation was state sovereignty itself, the power of state governments over the central government, such as it was, because the power of the states was so significant under the Articles that you almost have trouble even using the term central government. There were many things that the central government under the Articles could do. But the fact of the matter is, on the most important things which gave the central government power and independence from the states, those were powers denied to the central government under the Articles. Those are powers that Madison believed had to be delivered to the central government in order to make a central government viable. So Madison listed the various failings of the states under the Articles. And very quickly, these were, number one, failure of the states to comply with constitutional requisitions. Madison believed that even though the federal government requested things from the states, because it didn't have the power to dictate them, the states refused to comply. The second item, encroachments by the states on federal authority. Things that clearly ought to be powers exercised by the central authority were being exercised by the states. Third, violations of the laws of nations and of treaties by the states. The states were too political. They were too conscious and sensitive to their own power. They were critical of the surrendering of their power to anybody else. And so consequently, in many cases, the central government didn't fulfill its obligations to the nation, even under the Articles. Violations of the law of nations and of treaties. Number 4, trespasses of the states on the rights of each other. Rather than cooperate, these states often competed against each other. They formed coalitions of some states against other states in trying to get the national capital, for example, in order to decide under the Constitution where the capital of the nation would be, because they knew that wherever the Congress was, wherever Congress met, wherever the central government was located, that was not only going to be the political center of the country, it was likely also to be the financial center of the country. So the states competed with each other to be selected as that site. And many states consolidated with other states to work against the interests of states which they believed were not best for their own interests. So the states worked against each other rather than with each other in many cases. The fifth item Madison lists is the want of concert, agreement, in matters where common interest requires it. In things where the states clearly would accomplish more by working together, they couldn't organize to work together. They were pitted against each other. They were selfish of each other. They found it difficult to cooperate with each other. Consequently, they made it impossible for the central government effectively to do even the powers or the things that it had the power to do. Yet another item, the lack of a guarantee to the states of their constitutions and laws against internal violence. States did not have the power to put down revolution within the states themselves. If a particular movement began within a state to topple the government of that state, it was difficult, if not impossible, to get the other states to come together and unify for the protection of that state and its constitution against internal rebellion. Yet another weakness of government under the Articles is what Madison called the want of sanction to the laws and of coercion in the government of the Confederacy. The central government didn't have the power to coerce. It didn't have the power to force. It didn't have the power to punish people that didn't do what it asked them to do or told them to do. In other words, it was too weak. It was forced intentionally to depend on the states for whatever power it needed. And oftentimes that didn't work. The next criticism of the states, of the Articles Madison makes, is want of ratification by the people of the Articles of Confederation. And that's the thing we talked about earlier with the ratification of the Constitution. Madison believed that in order to be effective, in order to have the power of citizens behind it, the central government, the federal government, needed to have the ratification of the people, not just the state governments. And then Madison said weaknesses were the multiplicity of laws in the several states. There were so many different laws, competing laws, variations on the same law, that it was impossible for citizens to know what the law was, especially if they moved from one state to the other. Also, not only was there such a multiplicity of laws, were there so many of them, but they were changeable. Mutability of the laws of the states, Madison said, was a weakness. They could be changed depending on an election. Elections under the Articles were frequent. Most cases, annual elections. Governments, legislatures were turned over annually. Different people got power on a regular basis. And the first thing they would do is change the laws to benefit or suit themselves. And so the result was that you had 13 different states where the laws were changing so rapidly that it was impossible for people to know what was going on. And then Madison said there was the injustice of the laws of the states. Many of the states made it legal to discriminate against other states. In other words, not pay your financial obligations, not pay your debts, or to discriminate against citizens of other states. For example, if in your state you printed paper money in order to make currency more available to your citizens, the value of that money would go down. And by tampering with the value of your money, you were treating other states unfairly or unjustly, because you were giving your citizens the right to pay off their obligations in dollars that weren't worth nearly what the dollars were when you first borrowed them. Madison made a special emphasis on this issue of injustice. He said, and this is a quote from the document, the Vice's document, "If the multiplicity and mutability of laws prove a want of wisdom, their injustice betrays a defect still more alarming. More alarming not merely because it's a greater evil in itself, but because it brings more into question the fundamental principles of Republican government, that the majority who rule in such governments are the safest guardians of both public good and of private rights." What bothered Madison was, when you put together the mutability and the multiplicity of laws in the states, and then you add the injustice of so many of these laws, the result is that citizens begin to question the very viability of Republican government at all. They begin to doubt whether popular government can even work. And to Madison, that was a real danger. And then finally, the last two items in Madison's list, especially this one, the very impotence of the laws of the states. The fact of the matter is, with state power being supreme, government being susceptible to majorities of the people in their own states, made the laws always impotent and ineffective. You couldn't enforce them, because if you tried to enforce them so hard that you built up an opposition, that opposition would take power at the next elections and undo everything you did. So the fact of the matter is, state governments, Madison believed, were too vulnerable to majority rule. And let me close, because we've only got about 2 minutes left in our time together today. Let me close with this statement Madison makes under his heading, Impotence of the Laws of the States. A still more fatal, if not more frequent cause, lies among the people themselves. In Republican government, the majority, however composed, ultimately give the law. Whenever, therefore, an apparent interest or common passion unites a majority, what is to restrain them from unjust violations of the rights and interests of the minority or of individuals? In other words, what Madison is saying and explaining is the impotence of the laws. That because government is vulnerable to majority rule on a regular, frequent basis, it makes it impossible for government to enforce anything. Madison says there are only 3 checks on the majority's ability to do this. The first check is a regard to their own good and the good of the community at large. The second one is respect for character. And even though we may respect individuals to do the right thing, when they are so easily able to organize with other people who want the same thing, they become obsessive. And oftentimes the ethics and morality which guides their behavior is pushed into the background as they become victims of what we call groupthink. And then the third check is religion. And of course, Madison's conclusion is none of those 3 things is effective. So what you've got to do is structure government in such a way that you offset those 3 things because they don't work. And that's really the lead-in to the structure of the Constitution that Madison creates. With that, we're going to end our program today. Let me remind you, we will not be doing a live program tomorrow. We will be doing a live program on Wednesday, and we'll return to this particular issue. For Bob Kincaid and Agnes at Head On, this is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so very, very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy tomorrow as well. And if everything works out, Lord willing, we'll be back together on Wednesday. Thank you. Have a great day.